Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. And may the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we have an incredibly ambitious and, well, really profound journey ahead of us. We are taking a comprehensive, magnifying glass look at Surah Al-Insaan.
Right, which is the 76th chapter of the Quran.
Exactly. And if you were familiar with the text, you might actually know this chapter by a few other names. Some call it Surah Ad-Dar, which translates to time. Others refer to it as Surah Al-Ata, meaning has there come, which is based on its opening words.
And you'll also hear it called Surah Al-Abrar, referring to the righteous.
Yeah, precisely. So our mission today is to literally trace the biography of the human soul. We are going to start from absolute, microscopic, cosmic obscurity, a time when we were quite literally nothing worth mentioning.
Nothing at all.
Right. And we're going to follow that thread all the way to humanity's ultimate eternal destination. We'll be unpacking the wisdom of every single verse, from verse 1 through verse 31, and extracting the lessons embedded in this incredible text.
It really is a remarkable chapter to analyze. And just to set the table for you, the listener, we are drawing our insights today from an exhaustive synthesis of Orthodox Sunni scholarship. We are relying entirely on the classical and modern tafsir tradition.
That's the rich, rigorous science of Quranic exegesis, right?
Correct. We are pulling from the foundational works of scholars who dedicated their entire lives to understanding the linguistic nuances, the historical context, and the profound spiritual dimensions of these specific words.
So before we even look at the very first word of the chapter, let's talk about the why. For someone listening right now, maybe you're driving to work, maybe you're doing the dishes, or just going about your daily routine. How should you frame this chapter in your mind? Why is Surah Al-Insaan so pivotal that we are dedicating an entire deep dive to it?
I would suggest framing it as a tool with two massive interconnected functions. On one level, it provides a highly rigorous, actionable, ethical framework. It doesn't just offer vague platitudes about being a good person.
Right, it's not just be nice to people.
Exactly. It gives you a highly specific, operational blueprint of the righteous archetype, what the text calls al-abrar. And on the other level, it is an eschatological blueprint.
Meaning deals with the end of times and the afterlife.
Yes, it deals directly with the ultimate destiny of humanity, the actual mechanics of the afterlife, and the cosmic scales of justice.
But it's more than just a rule book and a map of the afterlife, isn't it? There's a psychological utility to it.
It absolutely has a psychological utility, and that is what is truly fascinating here. This chapter is fundamentally designed to recalibrate human consciousness.
Recalibrate it how?
Well, when you really absorb what it's saying, it acts as a direct, systematic mechanism to combat modern narcissism, the inflation of the ego, and our almost biological obsession with immediate gratification.
Wow.
Yeah, it forces you to look backward at your incredibly fragile, almost humiliating origins, and then it juxtaposes that against the breathtaking, terrifying scale of what is to come. It humbles you and elevates you at the exact same time.
I really want to focus on that phrase you used, recalibrate human consciousness. Because what's so striking to me is that this recalibration wasn't supposed to just be something you experienced once a year during Ramadan or whenever you happen to randomly flip open the book.
No, not at all.
It was actually woven into the physical, weekly rhythm of life for the early Muslim community. Let's talk about the Friday prayer, because the way this surah was utilized historically is a huge lesson in itself.
It absolutely is. The liturgical importance of Surah Al-Insaan is firmly cemented in the authentic Sunni Hadith literature. If you look at the primary sources, specifically the collections of Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, you find authentic narrations.
Mostly from Abu Huraira, right?
Yes, primarily reported by Abu Huraira. They detail a very specific, consistent practice of the Prophet Muhammad. Every single Friday during the congregational Fajr prayer, that's the prayer performed at the very break of dawn, the Prophet had a routine.
A weekly routine.
A strict weekly routine. In the first unit of that prayer, he would recite Surah As-Sajda, which is chapter 32. And in the second unit, without fail, he would recite Surah Al-Insaan.
Wait, every single Friday, Don? That seems like a highly deliberate structural choice. I mean, with 114 chapters in the Quran, why those two specific chapters, and why on Friday morning of all times?
To understand the why, we really have to dive into the theology of Friday within the Islamic tradition. Classical Sunni giants, particularly scholars like Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn al-Qayyim, have written extensively on the profound psychological and spiritual wisdom behind this exact practice.
Okay, unpack that for us.
You see, in Islamic theology, Friday isn't just the day of the congregational sermon, and it's certainly not just the end of the work week. It is recognized as the day that Adam, the first human being, was created.
The genesis of humanity.
Exactly. And equally significant, it is the day that the final hour, the day of judgment, will ultimately be established.
That is incredible context. So Friday effectively serves as the bookends of all human existence. It's the starting line of humanity, and it's the finish line.
Precisely. So when the prophet paired these two specific chapters on this specific morning, he was establishing what scholars call a divine pedagogy, a masterful teaching method.
So paint that picture for us. What does that experience look like?
Imagine the scene. You are standing in congregation at the very break of dawn. The world is still dark and quiet, and you are forced to confront the entirety of the human life cycle. You are verbally reminded of your intensely humble origins, being fashioned from clay and mingled fluids, and then you are immediately propelled forward to envision the ultimate reckoning.
It's an enforced reality check before the sun even comes up.
It really is. It ensures that the believer begins the most sacred day of the week entirely grounded. You start your day with an acute hyper-awareness of your own human insignificance, while simultaneously recognizing the absolute majesty of the divine.
So translate that to the listener today. We schedule things to maintain our lives, right? We go to the gym on a set schedule to maintain our cardiovascular health. We schedule dental cleanings every 6 months. But we often treat spiritual health as this passive thing that just happens to us.
Which is a massive mistake.
Exactly. This prophetic tradition teaches us that spiritual health requires systematic maintenance. You need a regular, scheduled confrontation with your own mortality and your own origins. Because if you go weeks or months or years without deeply reflecting on where you came from and where you are going, your ego will naturally inflate to fill that void.
It's human nature.
Right. You start thinking you are the center of the universe. The weekly recitation of Surah Al-Insaan was the prophet's mechanism for keeping the human ego perpetually in check.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. And it actually leads us into a fascinating academic debate about the text itself, which offers another profound lesson in how we understand moral frameworks.
The Makki versus Madani debate, right?
Yes. In the classical Quranic sciences, there is an ongoing discussion regarding the timeline of when Surah Al-Insaan was revealed. Was it revealed in Makkah during the early, highly persecuted part of the prophethood before the migration? Or was it revealed in Medina years later, after the Islamic State was formally established?
Okay, let's pause here. For a modern listener, Makki versus Madani might sound like inside baseball theological jargon. Why does the geography or the timeline of a chapter's revelation actually matter to how we apply its lessons today?
It matters immensely because it dictates how we view the universality of the ethics presented in the text. The overwhelming majority view within Orthodox Sunni scholarship, and here we are talking about heavyweights like al-Zamakhshari, al-Baydawi, Hafiz ibn Kathir, and modern exegetes like Abu al-Maududi, they all classify Surah Al-Insaan as purely Makki. It belongs to the early Meccan period.
And what is their methodology for arriving at that conclusion? They aren't just guessing.
No, their argument is deeply structural and linguistic. Take Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, for example. He looked at the actual rhythm and the punchiness of the Arabic in the surah. When you read it in Arabic, the verses are brief, sharp, and highly rhythmic.
Like the early revelations usually are.
Exactly. Furthermore, the intense thematic focus on eschatology, human origins, the utter reality of the Day of Judgment, these are the undeniable hallmarks of early Makki revelations. It's designed to shake a polytheistic society awake.
It's a wake-up call.
Yes. Thematically, it flows perfectly from the preceding early Makki surahs, like Surah Al-Qiyamah. It feels like a foundational, earth-shattering theological treatise.
But there is a minority view that pushes back on this, right? Some commentators argue that it's Madani, or at least that certain verses were dropped into it later in Medina. Where does that theory come from?
The minority view relies on a concept called Asbab al-Nuzul, which translates to the reasons for revelation or the historical triggers for a verse. There are specific historical reports, often attributed to Ibn Abbas, regarding a family in Medina who fed a captive, an orphan, and a poor person.
Right, because verse 8 of this surah explicitly mentions the righteous feeding a captive or an asir.
Precisely. So some scholars argue this entire section must have been revealed in Medina, perhaps after the Battle of Badr.
Because the logic is, in Makkah, The Muslims were a persecuted minority without a state. They didn't have prisoners of war. So how could a verse command them to feed captives if there were no captives to feed?
Exactly. That is the crux of the minority argument. However, modern Orthodox exegetes, particularly someone as rigorously analytical as Madudi, push back against this Madani classification with brilliant logic.
Let's break down Maudu'i's logic, because I find it fascinating how he protects the structural integrity of the text.
Maududi argues that if you do a careful, holistic analysis of the surah, you see an unbroken, highly integrated chain of thought. It is a single, continuous, sweeping argument about the soul. If you were to surgically extract verses 8 through 10 and say, oh, these were just reactionary verses dropped in later in Medina because of a specific event, it completely ruptures the natural linguistic and conceptual continuity of the chapter.
It's like taking a paragraph from a later chapter of a novel and jamming it into the prologue. It doesn't fit the flow.
Precisely. Furthermore, scholars like Imam Badr al-Din al-Zarkashi and Hafiz ibn Taymiyyah bring up a critical, often misunderstood nuance regarding the science of asbab al-nuzul itself.
What's the nuance?
Ibn Taymiyyah explains that when classical reporters state a verse was revealed concerning a specific historical event, it frequently means that the verse's general ruling applies to that event. It does not necessarily mean that the event historically triggered the original revelation of the verse.
Ah, that is a massive distinction. So the Meccan verses established the moral baseline, and later Medinan events merely fulfilled or acted upon those pre-existing moral frameworks.
Exactly. And the life lesson here for you, the listener, is about textual integrity and the universality of morals. Ethical mandates, like the command to feed captives and care for the vulnerable, transcend specific historical triggers.
They aren't just reactionary policies written on the fly because one family did something nice on a Tuesday in Medina.
No, they form the universal, unbroken bedrock of the Islamic moral framework, established from day one in Makkah, serving as a standard for all human behavior across all eras.
That context is incredible. With that bedrock established, let's actually dive into the text itself. The surah opens with an absolute ontological earthquake. It completely shatters our standard understanding of our own existence. Verse 1 reads, "Has there not been over man a period of time when he was not a thing worth mentioning?"
It's a powerful opening.
It really is. Let's look at the phrasing here, because every word is doing heavy lifting. It starts with the interrogative Arabic particle, how.
Linguistically, how functions as a question. But the classical exegetes are quick to clarify that how, in this specific context, carries the rhetorical weight of the word quad, which implies absolute, undeniable certainty. It translates more accurately to indeed or undoubtedly.
So it's not a genuine inquiry where God doesn't know the answer.
Of course not. It is a rhetorical device used by the creator to establish a self-evident truth. It's the equivalent of standing outside at noon, pointing directly at the sun and asking, is it not day? The question is designed to make the listener arrive at the undeniable yes.
And then we get to this mind-bending concept of time. The phrase used is hinun min al-dar.
The grammar here is incredibly specific. The Arabic utilizes nanation, or the tanwin suffix. In this context, it signifies indefiniteness. It is pointing to an immensely long, vast, unquantifiable span of cosmic time. And the word dar itself, meaning endless time, holds deep significance in Sunni theology.
I recall there's an authentic hadith where the prophet specifically warns people against cursing time.
Yes. In Sahih Muslim, the prophet explicitly forbade people from abusing or cursing time when things go wrong. He said, do not abuse time, for Allah is time.
Wait, Allah is time. That sounds like a paradox. How do scholars interpret that?
It doesn't mean God is bound by the physical dimension of time as we experience it. It means that Allah is the ultimate creator, master, and controller of all temporal vicissitudes. Time is simply a mechanism, a physical law, enacted by his will.
So you're criticizing the designer when you criticize the design.
Exactly. When you curse the passage of time or your era, you are essentially criticizing the decree of the creator who governs that time.
So verse 1 sets up this incredible, humbling paradox. It acknowledges that the raw materials that make up man, the atoms that make up you and me listening right now, technically existed within the universe during this infinite epoch of endless time, the Dar. But we existed in a state that was utterly unmentionable.
The Arabic is lam yakun sha'na madhkura.
Not a thing worth mentioning.
In his monumental work, Ma'arif al-Quran, Mufti Muhammad Shafi provides two primary interpretations of what this unmentionable period actually refers to. Both interpretations are designed to completely dismantle human arrogance.
Let's hear the first one.
The first interpretation is what we could call the gestational phase. This refers to the roughly 9-month period from conception to birth. Think about that process. A human being transitions from a microscopic singular drop to a developing fetus hidden in the absolute darkness of the womb.
Right.
During this entire phase, your identity, your name, your gender, your future societal value, your wealth, all of it is entirely unknown and utterly unmentionable to the outside world. You exist biologically, but you are a secret to society. You have no status.
That's humbling enough, but the second interpretation zooms out even further, doesn't it?
What's
It
up?
takes us to a cosmic scale.
Yes, the second interpretation is the cosmic or evolutionary phase. Before you were biological matter in a room, the elemental substance that comprises your physical body existed for millennia.
We're talking chemistry now.
Exactly. The carbon in your muscles, the oxygen in your lungs, the iron in your blood, it existed in the form of inert soil, ocean water, atmospheric gases, and literal stardust for billions of years before being synthesized into the biological matter that eventually produced your specific human lineage.
That's wild to think about.
For absolute eons, the atoms that currently make up your body were utterly anonymous. They were completely unmentionable as the entity you call you.
Let's bring this right to the listener's doorstep. Why start a holy text, a book of divine guidance, with an astrophysics and biology lesson?
Because it is the ultimate, universally applicable antidote to narcissism.
Think about the era we live in today. We're dominated by hyper-individualism. Everyone has a personal brand on social media. We have massive collective ego inflation. We spend so much of our waking energy, our money, and our anxiety desperately trying to be worth mentioning. We want the likes, the legacy, the recognition.
And this opening verse is a stark, grounding reality check.
It really is. It forces your intellect to reflect on that infinite span of time, the Dar, where you were completely, totally irrelevant. The universe functioned perfectly fine without you for billions of years. Reflecting on this fosters a radical, necessary humility.
It dismantles arrogance.
It demands that we submit to the omniscience of the Creator, who finally, purposefully, decided to pull our specific atoms from cosmic obscurity into existence.
That is precisely the intended psychological effect. And that transition from cosmic obscurity into physical existence leads immediately into verse 2, which outlines the mechanics of the divine test. The verse reads, "Verily, we created man from a drop of mingled sperm so that we may test him, and therefore we made him hearing and seeing."
The biological genesis is highly specified here with the term nutfa amshash.
Getting a drop of mingled fluids. It perfectly scientifically describes the synthesis of male and female genetic material.
But what I find fascinating is that the Quran doesn't linger on the biology. It states the biological fact and then pivots instantly to teleology, the purpose of that biology. We weren't just created from mingled fluids to exist aimlessly. We were synthesized for a specific, immense reason to be tested.
The Arabic word is nabtalihi.
To test him.
Exactly. The entirety of human existence is framed as an active, ongoing trial. And to equip humanity for this monumental existential test, Allah endows man with specific, highly advanced tools, the faculties of hearing and sight. Now, within the Sunni tafsir tradition, it is crucial to understand that these faculties extend far, far beyond mere biological sensory perception.
We aren't just talking about the mechanical function of your eardrums and your retinas.
Not at all. These physical senses are metaphors for the cognitive, intellectual apparatus required to process moral and spiritual data.
I read some commentary from the Al-Salam Institute on this specific phrasing, and I found it incredibly striking. They note that hearing and seeing are actually divine attributes. In Islamic theology, Allah is Al-Sami, the all-hearing, and Al-Basir, the all-seeing.
That is a profound, deeply layered theological connection. The language here deliberately crosses the boundary between the divine domain and the human domain. God is communicating that he guides humankind using terms, concepts, and attributes that they can cognitively process because he has lent a shadow of those attributes to them.
So it's a shared vocabulary of capability.
Exactly. To be endowed with hearing and seeing in this specific Quranic context is to possess the sensible and intelligent capacity to observe the signs of Allah in the natural universe. It is the ability to comprehend divine revelation when it is spoken to you, to reflect on history, and to arrive at rational, ethical conclusions. Your intellect is the primary tool given to you to navigate the test of life.
Which brings us to verse 3. The great bifurcation of destiny, the ultimate fork in the road. Verily, we showed him the way whether he be grateful or ungrateful.
Having been equipped with those intellectual faculties we just discussed, humanity is not left to wander blindly in the dark. We are presented with clear, undeniable guidance. This guidance manifests externally through the sending of prophets and the revelation of scriptures, and it manifests internally through the innate, pure human disposition.
That's known as the fitra, right?
Yes, the fitra, combined with the power of human intellect. This verse beautifully highlights the orthodox Islamic doctrine of human free will. Allah illuminates the path, the signposts are all vividly clear. But the moral agency to actually put one foot in front of the other, to choose to traverse that path, rests squarely and heavily on the shoulders of the individual human being.
And the outcome of exercising that agency is binary. There's no middle ground here. The verse uses two highly specific terms, shakir and kafur. Shakir refers to the one who is grateful and submitting. Kafur is the one who is ungrateful and rejecting. And I want to pause here for you, the listener, because we really need to redefine what gratitude means in this paradigm.
It is essential to redefine it because the Quranic concept of gratitude is very different from what we typically assume in modern English.
Right. When we hear gratitude, we usually think of an internal feeling, a warm, fuzzy emotion, or simply remembering to say thank you after someone holds the door or buys us a coffee. But gratitude in the Quranic paradigm is not passive. It is kinetic action.
It requires movement.
Yes, it is the physical and intellectual utilization of those God-given faculties of hearing, seeing, and intellect in active obedience to the divine will. You show gratitude for your eyes not just by saying thanks, but by looking at permissible things and actively reflecting on the majesty of creation. You show gratitude for your intellect by diligently seeking the truth and rejecting falsehood.
And the opposite is true for ingratitude.
Exactly. Conversely, ingratitude, the root of kufru or disbelief, is not just passive skepticism. It is the active, muscular suppression of the truth. It is the weaponization of your God-given faculties against the Creator who gave them to you. The fundamental lesson here is that passive belief is insufficient. True gratitude requires ethical, kinetic action.
That sets the stage perfectly for the next phase of the surah. We've established the fork in the road in verse 3. Now, the text vividly, unapologetically details the consequences of each path. Verse 4 begins by outlining the terrifying reality for the kafir, the one who chose the path of active ingratitude. It states, "Verily, we have prepared for the disbelievers iron chains, iron collars, and a blazing fire."
We just went from discussing stardust and gratitude to iron chains. The camera flips, and it's a stark, almost violent tonal shift. It is entirely meant to be jarring. The Quran uses rhetorical shock to awaken the deadened heart. For those who exercise their free will to actively reject divine guidance, the text outlines an inescapable, suffocating, eschatological reality. According to Tafsir Ibn Kathir, the punishment involves salasil, which are heavy binding chains,
Nice.
aglal, which are iron collars permanently fixed around the neck, and sa'ir, the blazing, incinerating flame. But we cannot just read this as a horror story. We must understand the deep psychological symbolism embedded in this specific punishment. The physical manifestation of their torment perfectly, poetically mirrors their worldly psychology.
Let's unpack that symbolism. How exactly do iron collars mirror someone's worldly psychology?
Think deeply about the physical posture of arrogance. The iron collars, the aglal, are described as being rounded over their necks, restricting movement and forcing the head into a fixed position. In the worldly life, these individuals displayed intense psychological and intellectual stubbornness.
They were rigid.
They possessed a hardened arrogance. When presented with the truth, they stiffened their necks. They absolutely refused to bow their heads in humility, prayer, and submission to God. Because they rigidly held their heads high in false, unearned pride in this temporary life, divine justice dictates that in the eternal life, their physical bodies reflect their spiritual state.
So the outside matches the inside.
Exactly. Their heads are permanently locked in collars of humiliation. They are violently dragged and incinerated because that is the ultimate natural consequence of squandering their advanced cognitive faculties and catastrophically failing the trial of existence.
It is a profoundly sobering reminder that our internal actions, our pride, our stubbornness, carry massive external consequences. Intellectual arrogance, the delusion that we know better than the creator of the cosmos, is the ultimate precursor to spiritual destruction. But the Quran never leaves you in despair without showing you the alternative. The very next verse flips the camera entirely. We move from the suffocating, blazing fire to the ultimate contrast, the Abrar, the eminently righteous.
Yes, verses 5 through 10 provide a beautifully detailed 6-verse exposition on the character and the reward of the virtuous. It begins by engaging the sensory rewards. Verse 5 and 6 describe the Abrar drinking from a cup mixed with water from a special spring in paradise called kafur, or camphor. The text says, "A spring wherefrom the slaves of Allah will drink, causing it to gush forth abundantly."
Camphor is a really interesting specific choice. In our physical world, camphor has a very strong, distinct, almost medicinal smell. It's used in balms to clear the sinuses, and ironically, it's used heavily in the Islamic tradition during the washing of the dead before burial.
That's a great observation, and classical exegetes absolutely note this parallel, but they emphasize a crucial overarching rule when interpreting the descriptions of paradise: the like and unlike principle. Heavenly camphor possesses the deeply cooling, soothing, and beautifully fragrant properties of earthly camphor, but it is entirely stripped of any of its toxic, bitter, or overwhelmingly pungent earthly traits.
So it's the best of it without any of the drawbacks.
The great early scholar Al-Hasan al-Basri noted its unparalleled pleasantness, comparing its refreshing coolness to the pleasant sharpness of ginger. It's a sensory experience that our current biology cannot fully comprehend.
But the most fascinating part of these two verses isn't just the flavor of the water, it's the physics of this heavenly spring. Verse 6 introduces the concept of tafjir.
Yes, the Arabic word tafjir means to cause to gush forth, to dictate the flow. This spring doesn't just passively flow in a fixed geographical riverbed like the Amazon or the Nile. The verse explicitly states that the servants of Allah possess the capability to cause the spring to gush forth precisely where they desire it.
Wherever they are.
If they are reclining in their palaces, strolling through their gardens, or sitting with their families, they merely command the water and it flows dynamically exactly to them without flooding or making a mess.
Let's connect this to the bigger picture, because this is wild. Why are they given this hyper-specific superpower to control water? To me, it reads as the ultimate manifestation of sovereignty through submission. In this worldly life, these righteous individuals voluntarily relinquished control. They submitted their worldly desires, their massive egos, and their daily actions to the strict command of Allah.
They restrain themselves.
They gave up illicit control over their wealth and their bodies here. The direct reciprocal spiritual reward for that absolute submission is absolute command over their heavenly environment in the next life. They become the literal masters of their domain because they master their own souls first. It's essentially the ultimate heavenly version of a smart home, but governed purely by the will of the believer.
That is a brilliant analogy. Master the soul here, master the environment there. But the Surah doesn't just shower praise on the Abrar and leave their worldly identity ambiguous. We don't have to guess how to become them. The text transitions immediately into its stringent, actionable checklist of their behavioral traits. Verses 7 through 10 establish a timeless, highly demanding blueprint for human ethics. It outlines 5 core traits.
Let's go through this checklist one by one, because this is the operational core of the entire surah. Trait number 1, found in verse 7, fulfillment of vows. They fulfill their vows.
This simple phrase indicates absolute, unwavering integrity. When the righteous make a pledge, whether it is a solemn oath to Allah, like a vow to fast or give charity, or a contractual commitment to another human being, they fulfill it. They do not look for loopholes. They demonstrate an unwavering commitment to their moral and contractual obligations. They are fundamentally deeply reliable people.
Trait number 2, also in verse 7, eschatological anxiety. And they fear a day whose evil will be widespreading.
Now, in modern psychology, we generally view anxiety as a negative, debilitating trait. But here, the Quran frames it as a highly productive, pervasive fear of the Day of Judgment. This fear is not paralyzing, it is mobilizing. It is the primary internal catalyst that ensures their ethical conduct remains razor-sharp even when no one else is watching, because they know the Creator is always watching.
And then we get to trait number 3, which is really the pinnacle of the surah's ethical instruction, found in verse 8, selfless altruism.
Yeah.
And they give food, in spite of their love for it, to the miskin, the poor, the orphan, and the captive. And this specific verse leads us into another fascinating historical and theological debate, doesn't it?
It certainly does. There is a highly circulated narrative, very popular in Friday sermons and poetry, that asserts verses 8, 9, and 10 were revealed regarding a very specific, isolated incident involving Ali ibn Abi Talib and his wife Fatima, the beloved daughter of the Prophet Muhammad.
I've heard this story, the story of the 3 days of fasting.
Yes. The traditional narrative claims that Ali and Fatima vowed to fast for 3 consecutive days for the recovery of their young children, Hassan and Hussein, who had fallen ill. Upon breaking their fast each evening with a meager amount of bread, a different individual arrived at their door begging for food. A poor man arrived the first night, an orphan the second night, and a captive the third night.
And they gave it all away.
According to the story, despite their own severe, gnawing hunger, they donated their entire meal each night, drinking only water, prompting Allah to reveal these specific verses in their honor.
It's an incredibly moving story, a beautiful, romantic testament to ultimate selflessness. But, as our sources indicate, rigorous Orthodox Sunni scholars have heavily scrutinized this narrative. Why would scholars push back on such a beautiful story?
Because classical scholarship prioritizes truth and theological consistency over mere emotional resonance. Stringently critical exegetes and hadith scholars, most notably giants like Hafiz ibn Taymiyyah, Badr al-Din al-Zarkashi, and modern analysts like Abu al-Maududi, have challenged this narrative as the exclusive reason for revelation on three major fronts: historical methodology, theological consistency, and legal reality. First, from a strict hadith methodology perspective, the chains of transmission, the isnad, for this specific event triggering the revelation possess significant weaknesses and broken links.
And Maududi points out a profound theological and character inconsistency, right? I found his logic here impenetrable.
Maududi's analysis is brilliant. He argues that it is practically inconceivable that paragons of Islamic jurisprudence and deep compassion like Ali and Fatima would subject young children who are supposedly recovering from a severe illness to 3 consecutive days of literal starvation. Islamic law vehemently prioritizes the preservation of life and health above voluntary fasting or voluntary charity. To starve recovering children would contradict Ali and Fatima's known, profound understanding of Islamic jurisprudence.
That makes perfect sense. You don't break a fundamental law of preserving life to perform a voluntary act of charity. And the third point of scrutiny is the legal anachronism regarding the captive mentioned in the verse.
Right. The mention of an asir, a captive or prisoner of war, begging door to door for food in Medina completely contradicts the historical and legal reality of the early Islamic state. The state apparatus itself, overseen by the Prophet, was legally responsible for feeding and housing prisoners of war.
They weren't just left to wander.
Exactly. Furthermore, if a captive was placed in a specific individual's custody, that individual was legally bound by Islamic law to feed them from their own provision. The captive wouldn't be wandering the streets at night, begging at random doors.
So if we look at the Orthodox Sunni consensus, they posit that while the righteous early Muslims, undoubtedly including incredible figures like Ali and Fatima, fully embodied these magnificent traits, the verses themselves represent a universal archetype. They weren't just a reactionary reward for one historically contested event. And recognizing this universality allows us to extract a much more powerful immediate life lesson for today, the absolute redefinition of philanthropy.
Also, connect that to the listener.
Think about modern charity. So much of our philanthropy today is deeply intertwined with ulterior motives. It's corporate social responsibility campaigns designed for public relations. It's driven by tax incentives. Or, on a personal level, it's the pursuit of social capital, making sure everyone knows you gave, getting your name etched on a hospital wing, or securing an invite to a high society gala. Surah Al-Insaan completely strips charity of all ego and all ulterior motives.
It demands purity of intention.
It demands two things. First, giving must be physically or materially painful. The verse says you must give in spite of your love for it. You aren't just giving away your old, torn clothes or your excess wealth. You are giving the good food, the wealth you actually desperately want to keep for your own security. Second, it must be utterly anonymous in its psychological intent, which brings us perfectly to trait number 4 in verse 9, absolute sincerity.
Verse 9 explicitly voices the internal silent monologue of the righteous, saying, "We feed you seeking Allah's countenance only. We wish for no reward nor thanks from you." The Abber entirely obliterate their own egos in the act of giving. They don't want a plaque. They don't even want a verbal thank you.
That's a high bar.
To them, the transaction is purely between their soul and the divine. The poor person is merely the conduit for that worship.
And finally, trait number 5 in verse 10, reverence of the Lord. They explicitly state their fear of their Lord on a day that is described as abus, which is austere, frowning, and distressful, and commentator, horribly long and severe. Before we move on, I also want to just highlight the inclusion of the captive in verse 8 one more time. It establishes a breathtaking human rights mandate. Long before the Geneva Conventions, long before modern international law, this surah made the ethical treatment and feeding of prisoners of war, people who potentially just tried to kill you on a battlefield, an act of paramount heavenly worship.
It is an unparalleled ethical standard. And because these righteous individuals willingly subjected themselves to this extreme level of moral discipline in the worldly life, because they lived with the productive psychological distress of fearing the last day, the surah pivots beautifully to describe how Allah permanently, eternally removes all distress from them in the hereafter. Verses 11 through 22 provide what is arguably one of the most exhaustive, sensory-rich descriptions of Jannah, or paradise, found in the entire Quran.
Let's dive deep into the architecture and the bizarre, beautiful physics of paradise. Verse 11 declares that Allah will save them from the evil of that day and bestow upon them nadra.
The Arabic word nadra translates to a luminous, physical radiance of beauty. It is the outward physical glow that emanates from profound, absolute internal joy and relief. And verse 12 explicitly identifies the currency they use to purchase this reality, sabr: patience, steadfast perseverance, and endurance. Their exhausting endurance in the worldly life buys their garments of silk and their eternal paradise.
And the classical exegetes emphasize a crucial principle when reading these vivid descriptions, the like and unlike principle. The vocabulary used here, couches, silk, silver, crystal, trees, ginger, it's all familiar to our earthly human experience. God uses words we know. But the actual physical reality of these rewards defies our worldly comprehension entirely. Our human senses will have to be completely upgraded and adapted in the afterlife just to process the sheer magnitude of these blessings without being overwhelmed.
That principle is perfectly illustrated in verses 13 and 14, which describe the climate, comfort, and divine provision. The righteous recline on al-ara'ik, elevated, majestic couches with heavily curtained canopies. They will experience a meticulously balanced, perfect climate. The text specifies they will suffer neither the burning heat of the sun nor the bitter, biting cold.
And the nature itself is completely subjugated to them. The shades of the heavenly trees hang low over them, and the fruit is entirely, almost impossibly obedient. According to classical Sunni authorities like Mujahid and Qatada, if a believer stands, sits, or lies down, the branches of the trees automatically adjust their physical height to place the clusters of fruit directly into the believer's hands. There are no thorns. There is no need to reach or climb. Nature serves them effortlessly. Earlier, I joked about it being the ultimate food delivery, but it's even more profound. It's nature bending its own rules to honor the human being who honored God.
Then we encounter a beautiful linguistic and physical paradox in verses 15 and 16 regarding the vessels of paradise. The verses read, "And there will be passed round among them vessels of silver and cups of crystal, crystal clear, made of silver. They will determine the measure thereof according to their wishes."
Stop right there. Crystal clear, made of silver. That sounds physically impossible. It breaks the laws of physics.
Exactly. Tafsir Ibn Kathir points out this deliberate, brilliant material paradox. It is designed precisely to break the laws of physics in the reader's mind, to showcase the otherworldly, elevated, unconstrained nature of Jannah. In our temporal world, silver is a noble metal, but it is utterly opaque. You can't see through it. And glass or crystal is fully transparent, but it is relatively common and fragile.
Then they merge.
The vessels of paradise combine the finest qualities of both materials, discarding their worldly limitations. They possess the pristine, brilliant whiteness, strength, and nobility of silver, yet they are magically rendered with the absolute flawless transparency of crystal. You can see the pure, colored liquid inside perfectly through the solid silver exterior.
It's God flexing his creative power to prove that the next life is not bound by the periodic table of elements. And the verse continues, "They will determine the measure thereof." The drink is served in an exact, flawless measure that perfectly, precisely satiates the specific drinker's unique level of thirst. Not a single drop more, not a drop less. Perfect, customized equilibrium. Speaking of equilibrium, let's talk about the next drink they are served. In verses 17 and 18, we move from the cooling camphor to the warming ginger.
Yes. The text reads, "And they will be given to drink there a cup mixed with zanjabil, ginger, a spring there called salsabil." Abul al-Madudi notes a fascinating historical and cultural context here. The pre-Islamic Arabs, the immediate audience of this revelation, highly favored luxury wine that was infused with the sharp, warming spice of ginger. It was an imported, expensive luxury. Jannah provides the divine, purified counterpart to their highest worldly desire. It is a natural fountain yielding that beloved ginger flavor, but it's completely devoid of worldly bitterness, toxicity, hangovers, or any intoxicating effects that cloud the intellect.
So they have the camphor drink from earlier, which provides cooling relief, and they have the ginger drink, which provides warming invigoration. It creates this perfect physiological and spiritual equilibrium. And the source of this ginger drink is a heavenly spring called Salsabil.
Most classical Sunni commentators classify salsabil not just as a static name, but as an adjective functioning as a proper noun. It denotes water that flows with immense gushing swiftness, yet paradoxically it slides gently, sweetly, and perfectly palatably down the throat without choking the drinker.
It is absolute mind-bending sensory perfection. And the physical scale of this perfection is equally staggering. Verses 19 through 22 describe the immense grandeur of this kingdom. The service staff of paradise are described as Yodanan Mukaladan, immortal, everlasting youths. They never age, they never tire, and the imagery used is breathtaking. As they disperse across the palaces to serve, their sheer numbers, their radiant faces, their exquisite garments make them resemble perfectly scattered pearls across the landscape.
And verse 20 provides a breathtaking perspective on the scale of the reward. It explicitly declares that a mere glance at this realm reveals Mulkun Kabira, a great dominion, a massive, unfathomable kingdom. Authentic Sunni reports elaborate heavily on this concept, noting that even the individual occupying the absolute lowest, most baseline tier of paradise will possess a kingdom 10 times the physical size of the entire earthly realm. The physical adornments match this unimaginable royalty: sundus, which is fine, sheer green silk worn as undergarments, and istabrak, heavy, shimmering velvet brocade worn as outer garments, beautifully complemented by heavy silver bracelets.
But the absolute pinnacle of these rewards, the ultimate blessing described in this entire section, is what is called the Serabam Tahura. Verse 21 says, "And their Lord will give them a pure drink." Notice the shift in language. The immortal youths aren't clearing this. It is a pure, purifying drink administered directly by the Creator. What is the deep significance of this specific drink?
The exegetes explain that this purifying drink is not about quenching physical thirst at all. It acts as a divine metaphysical solvent. It physically and spiritually purges the human heart of any residual envy, malice, hatred, worldly trauma, or spiritual impurities that might have somehow carried over from the bitter struggles of the worldly life. It ensures an eternity of absolute psychological tranquility, profound peace, and perfect brotherhood.
This brings us to a massive, immediate life lesson for you listening today: the cleansing of the heart. The scholars are showing us through this verse that harboring deep hatred, envy, and malice is literally antithetical to the state of paradise. You simply cannot exist in Jannah with a polluted, hateful heart. The physics of the place won't allow it. Therefore, our mission in this temporal world is to strive relentlessly to purify our hearts now so that we are fit for the next world. You have to actively let go of the grudges. You have to purge the malice. You have to forgive.
And verse 22 concludes this breathtaking, overwhelming eschatological tour with what might be the most profoundly comforting divine validation found in the entire Quran. Verily, this is a reward for you, and your endeavor has been appreciated. Think deeply about the unfathomable weight of those words coming from the Creator of the cosmos. The exhaustive daily struggles in the worldly life, the long nights of fasting, the painful giving of cherished wealth, the constant grueling invisible battle against the ego and intense societal pressure, all of it is formally recognized, intimately validated, and eternally compensated by Allah. Your endeavor has been appreciated.
There is something incredibly profound about working your entire life, fighting your own demons and ego every single day, often feeling unappreciated by the world, and finally hearing the Creator of the universe say, "I saw what you did, and I appreciate it." That entirely changes how you view a difficult day at work, a moment of frustration, or an act of charity that goes unthanked. But getting to that point, earning that specific sentence, requires immense resilience in this harsh world. And that's exactly where the Surah takes us next. Following these breathtaking descriptions of paradise, the Surah abruptly, and I mean violently abruptly, shifts back to the harsh temporal world. It addresses the Prophet Muhammad directly.
This abrupt transition is entirely necessary because it bridges the vast gap between the eternal reward and the grueling earthly mechanics required to actually achieve it. Verse 23 states, "Verily, it is we who have sent down the Quran to you by stages."
By stages. The Arabic word used here relates to the concept of tanzil, gradual revelation. The Quran wasn't just dropped from the sky as a single fully bound book on a random Tuesday. It was revealed dynamically, piecemeal, ayah by ayah, over a grueling, bloody, exhausting 23-year period. Why drag it out like that?
Madudi explains that this verse serves as a direct, powerful rebuttal to the Meccan disbelievers. They constantly mocked the prophet, asking, why wasn't the book revealed all at once if it was truly from God? Why this piecemeal delivery? The gradual nature of the Quran was a deliberate, masterful manifestation of divine wisdom. The Quran carries a heavy, earth-shattering spiritual and psychological payload. Delivering it gradually allowed the Prophet and the nascent, heavily persecuted Muslim community to actually absorb it without breaking. It allowed them to implement massive societal, legal, and personal changes incrementally. And critically, it provided real-time, context-specific divine encouragement precisely when they were facing intense persecution. When they were tortured, a verse would arrive to steady their hearts.
The life lesson here is incredibly relevant to us today. It's about trusting the slow, unglamorous process of growth. We live in an instant download culture. We want all the answers, all the spiritual enlightenment, the six-pack abs, the financial freedom. We want it all immediately. But real spiritual development, absorbing heavy truths, and building unshakable character cannot be rushed. It requires steady, incremental exposure to truth over a long period of time. It's a grueling marathon, not a sprint.
And running that marathon requires immense fortitude, which is precisely why verse 24 issues a vital, unyielding command. Therefore be patient with constancy to the command of your Lord, and obey neither a sinner nor a disbeliever among them.
Be patient. We mentioned saber earlier as the currency used to buy paradise. But here, patience is contextualized not as passively sitting back and taking abuse, but as an active, muscular, defiant resistance.
Precisely. Allah commands the Prophet, and by extension, every single believer navigating this world, to exhibit sabra in executing the divine mission against immense societal opposition. But critically, this patience is instantly coupled with a command of active resistance. You must absolutely refuse to compromise your core Islamic principles. The text explicitly says, do not obey the atham, the one deeply immersed in sinful deeds, nor the kafur, the one hardened in disbelief. In the face of intense societal pressure, cancel culture, or the temptation to fit in, spiritual integrity demands an unyielding posture. You do not dilute the truth to appease the masses.
But practically speaking, how do you maintain that unyielding posture without burning out? Where do you get the psychological fuel to stand firm when the whole society is pushing against you? That is where verses 25 and 26 come in. They give us the absolute arsenal of the believer, the prescribed spiritual routine.
The verses instruct, and remember the name of your Lord every morning and afternoon. And during the night, prostrate yourself to him and glorify him a long night through. To sustain the immense psychological resilience required to resist the atham and the kafur, Allah prescribes a rigorous daily liturgical routine. Classical commentators identify the remembrance in the morning, bukra, and afternoon, asil, as encompassing the obligatory daily prayers, fajr, sur, and asr.
And then verse 26 shifts entirely to the night, mandating intense nocturnal devotion. Prostrating during the early night, which aligns with the Maghrib and Isha prayers, and engaging in extensive, prolonged glorification during the deep, silent watches of the night. This refers directly to the Tahajjud prayer, the voluntary night vigil, often accompanied by tartil, which is the measured, rhythmic, deep, contemplative recitation of the Quran.
The profound life lesson embedded here is what we might call the power of isolation. In deep Islamic theology, the nocturnal prayer, Tahajjud, is considered the ultimate primary reservoir of spiritual power. Think about the mechanics and the psychology of it. When the world is completely asleep, when your phone isn't buzzing, when there is absolutely no one watching to give you praise or social credit, you drag yourself out of a warm bed to stand in intimate, terrifyingly quiet communion with the divine. That profound, isolated, anonymous connection builds the metaphysical armor and the immense spiritual fortitude required to face the hostilities, the temptations, and the compromises of the daylight hours. You win the daytime battles during the absolute silence of the night.
You win the daytime battles in the silence of the night. That is incredibly profound. And that brings us to our final sequence of verses, verses 27 through 31. This concluding segment provides a razor-sharp, devastating critique of human short-sightedness, and then it fearlessly tackles one of the most complex, debated theological tensions in all of human history, the relationship between human free will and divine determinism. Let's start with verse 27, which perfectly diagnoses the pathology of modern materialism.
The verse reads, "Verily, these disbelievers love the present life of this world and put behind them a heavy day." The surah diagnoses the root cause of disbelief and ethical failure, not primarily as an intellectual deficit or lack of evidence, but as an acute, toxic emotional attachment to the ajila.
Ajila. That word literally means the hastily obtainable, doesn't it? The immediate gratification.
Exactly. The worldly life in its most fleeting sense. By allowing themselves to be wholly obsessively consumed with temporal, immediate pleasures, wealth, status, physical desires, the disbelievers intentionally ignore, suppress, and literally put behind their backs the impending, terrifying reality of the Yom Thakol, the heavy, burdensome day of accountability.
This verse is a mirror forcing you to evaluate your own long-term orientation. We are biologically, technologically, and culturally wired right now for instant gratification. Fast food, fast internet, immediate dopamine hits from scrolling social media, next day shipping. This verse establishes that spiritual failure is overwhelmingly a moral failure driven by the burning desire for unrestricted material indulgence. The believer is explicitly taught to delay immediate gratification for eternal, permanent success. You have to carry the heavy awareness of the heavy day to properly discipline your desires today.
And to further break down that human arrogance that demands instant gratification and ignores the Creator, verse 28 reminds mankind of their extreme physical contingency and profound fragility. It is we who created them, and we have made them of strong build. And when we will, we can replace them with others like them, with a complete replacement.
Allah is essentially saying, don't be arrogant about your physical strength, your technological advancements, or your worldly power. He engineered our biomechanics. He strengthened our joints.
Because human existence is entirely moment-to-moment dependent upon Allah's continuous sustaining power, He possesses the absolute sovereign right to annihilate a rebellious, arrogant generation instantly. And not just annihilate them, but replace them, the Quranic concept of tabdil, with a generation that is humble and obedient. The stark lesson is that human physical prowess and societal dominance are not inherent permanent traits. They are loaned assets, subject to immediate divine repossession if they are weaponized against the Creator.
Which brings us to the grand theological synthesis of the entire chapter, verses 29, 30, and 31. This is where the Orthodox Sunni framework of Qadar, or divine predestination, is beautifully, masterfully encapsulated. Verse 29 starts by handing the reins to the human. Verily, this is an admonition, so whosoever wills, let him take a path to his Lord.
This establishes the first pillar of the synthesis, human agency, or what classical scholars call cause, meaning acquisition. The text explicitly and undeniably affirms that human beings have legitimate free will. The Quran is an admonition, a reminder, and the individual possesses the localized autonomy to actually choose the path of righteousness. You have to make the choice. You are not a robot.
But then, verse 30 immediately zooms out to provide the necessary macro context, the absolute reality of the universe. But you cannot will unless Allah wills. Verily, Allah is ever all-knowing, all-wise.
And this establishes the second and third pillars of Qadar. The second pillar is divine sovereignty, or Mashia. Your human will, while real, does not operate in a vacuum. It cannot override the Creator of the universe. Human volition can only actualize, it can only manifest in reality if it aligns with the overarching, permissive will of Allah. You choose, but Allah must permit that choice to occur.
Let's use an analogy here because people often stumble on this paradox. Think of it like a captain sailing a ship across a massive ocean. The captain has human agency, Casbra. He turns the wheel, he adjusts the sails, he chooses the destination. He is putting in the effort. But the ocean, the weather, the currents, the wind is controlled entirely by God. That is divine sovereignty, Mashiach. The captain must steer the wheel, but he only actually arrives at his destination if the ocean permits it. But that raises the ultimate question. If Allah has to permit it, isn't that just arbitrary? Doesn't God just arbitrarily choose who wins and loses?
That is precisely where the third pillar, found at the very end of verse 30, is absolutely central to understand: divine wisdom. Allah's allowance or restriction of guidance is never, ever arbitrary. It is governed by His absolute perfect knowledge and wisdom. He is Aliman Hakima, all-knowing, all-wise. He knows precisely the condition, the sincerity, and the hidden motives of every single human heart. He guides and permits the success of those who exhibit genuine sincerity, humility, and a desperate desire for truth. And He allows the arrogant, those who actively suppress the truth and worship their own egos, to wander blindly in their chosen delusion.
It is the perfect, terrifying, beautiful balance. You must exert maximum human effort, steer the ship with all your might, but you must rely entirely, desperately, on God's grace and permission to arrive safely. And that leads to the final wrap-up of the surah in verse 31. He will admit to His mercy whom He wills, and as for the wrongdoers, He has prepared a painful torment. The surah concludes by stating the ultimate truth. Ultimate success is finding sanctuary in Allah's mercy. Conversely, the wrongdoers, the zalimin, those who consciously rejected the truth, who worship the temporal world in their own fleeting egos, they face a grievous, inevitable reality. Success requires absolute reliance on God alongside relentless human exertion.
It is a masterful, totally comprehensive conclusion to the biography of the human soul. It takes us from unmentionable cosmic dust, pushes us through the grueling crucible of worldly testing and free will, and brings us to the ultimate, permanent realization of divine justice and divine mercy.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over today. Think about the cyclical yet profoundly ascending nature of time that this entire chapter presents. We began our journey in verse 1 as an unmentionable concept, utterly lost in the vast, endless ocean of time, the Dar. In that state, time degraded our physical elements until God purposefully synthesized us. Yet if we use our free will to follow the blueprint of the Abra, we end the Surah stepping into an eternal, breathtaking paradise where time no longer degrades us, but entirely serves us. Immortal youths, everlasting joy, unaging bodies. The question you have to ask yourself today as you go back to your life is this: how will you use the lone, highly fragile, finite time you have right now to secure your place in that infinite reality? Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you with goodness for spending your valuable time listening to us.